Hello, good morning, and welcome to another episode of BitThink with me, Christina. This morning I want to talk a little bit further about investing in Bitcoin as a defensive strategy, given that, as far as I'm concerned, the number one use case for Bitcoin is as a censorship-resistant mechanism for value protection. This is especially relevant just now, given the multiple indicators of various forms of censorship that are both in operation and likely only to grow in the short term in the West. So I just want to start by saying a few words about the phrase censorship resistant. I think for people who are already within the Bitcoin crypto universe, it's a fairly well understood term, but I think it suffers from a couple of features, and those features make it really difficult for people who are not already inside of the crypto civilization to understand really what's being talked about and how it relates to them personally. So it is generally the case that the majority of people understand censorship to be specifically related to acts of speech, and then secondarily acts of printed expression. I think the more nuanced meaning of censorship within the context of money is perhaps lost on many of the just generally educated population out there, because it's not laid out very well what that means is control of. And I think that in the context of the flood of news, which I think is totally understandable on the backside of a flood of global talking heads conferences, along with a flood of awareness into the financial repressive system, that really there is a mechanism out there that is a way of end running censorship and control. I think it's not surprising that we see the kinds of bans on credit card usage that are emerging in the US and in the UK, along with the increasing difficulty of any kind of bank account usage in Australia or New Zealand, along with increasing difficulties with certain banks in Sweden. I think it's not unreasonable to take the opportunity, if you're in the crypto universe, to point out to people around you that these are exactly the mechanisms of censorship. These are exactly the indicators that any individual really has very much less control over their money than they might think. I mean, this is the moment in which to point out that censorship resistancy means control in ways that many just regular people think that they already have, and that talking about resisting financial repression is not some kind of Mad Max type of anarchistic hacker alternative from the regular daily life most people live. It's not some kind of future vision that has yet to exist in the West, and it's also not dismissible as some kind of reality that happens elsewhere in third world scenarios. So I think that one of the projects that anybody who supports Bitcoin or supports the premise of defensive, autonomous, free money, anybody who supports that in any way, there is an obligation in this moment to take on an educating function within your actual analog life. I have huge respect for Richard Hart as a person and as an intellectual, and I think that he is worth listening to on pretty much any subject he speaks about. And, we tend to, it seems to me, think these days in very binary ways. I either agree with you 100% or I don't agree with you 100%. And I think one of the really excellent things about Richard's thinking is that if if you're really engaged in thinking, he generates conversation and further thought. And so one of the things I wanted to respond to was the idea that the passion to promote the inherent value of Bitcoin, regardless of price, is a passion that should perhaps at this time be extended outwards to precisely people who don't understand how enslaved they already are. And this is the problem with becoming fluent in, let alone expert at, but just fluent in a new way of thinking. It's very easy to forget how much a person has learned, and that things that are clearly obvious to those who are effectively in the know remain totally unobvious to people who are not in the know. And so while there's an awful lot of useful and interesting discussion to be had about the price of Bitcoin, the markets, the psychology of momentum in price, various use cases in the present context, I think it's really important to return perhaps to the more basic message, which is that censorship, inappropriate levels of control that really erode fundamental freedoms on the basis of an idea that goes something like, prove your innocence. If you have nothing to hide, let me see everything. You cannot be trusted to make bad decisions that we've decided are bad decisions, so we'll let you gamble in Vegas with your credit card, but we won't let you buy crypto. We need to be in a position where we are pointing out that the function of Bitcoin from an autonomy point of view is the reason why people should be interested in investing in Bitcoin, which, as I have said in other videos, is different from trading and is, again, different from gambling. But that if investing is an exercise in believing, A, that something will continue to exist into the future, and that, B, its value will continue to remain relative to purchasing power, then Bitcoin is a very good bet in the event that the kind of censorship and control that we are currently experiencing only gets worse. And so at this point, I did also want to say, repeat something that I had said before, which is that, one wants to structure one's life in general, and certainly if one has any excess wealth to look after, you want to structure it in a way that you protect yourself against being wrong. And so that does talk about diversification. It does mean that all of the other asset classes which exist alongside and are perhaps more intermingled with Bitcoin than perhaps many who are deep in the cryptosphere think about all that often, these asset classes themselves are experiencing various levels of, whether it's manipulation or the side effects of financial repression or any of the big forces that are at play and that make Bitcoin a rational defensive move. I think it's important to realize that timing of the break in the stock market bubble, or timing of the break in the bond bubble, or timing of the falling away of the ability to continue to deny or kick down the road the reality of unfunded liabilities or debt burden. I mean, none of these things do I personally feel confident about calling a time frame on sufficiently well enough to go, I'm going to go all in on anything. And I think that if one accepts the idea that you have to be in a continuing, ongoing, dynamic relationship with how to think about your wealth, then it's not a bad place to be. So I think that continuing to engage in what is a dying, but who knows how fast that will take, there are financial systems and empires that have taken hundreds of years to die. So that while one recognizes one of the reasons that you may have come into Bitcoin was because you became aware or educated about the fragility of the Western financial, political, corporate system, it's not clear when and how there's going to be any kind of before and after singular event. And I'm not really a believer that there will be a singular event. I think human psychology would like that kind of certainty. We go from one day a mashup of all types of ways of structuring money to, the next day everybody and everything uses only Bitcoin. I mean, I think that is a reflection of a kind of human desire for certainty rather than kind of engaging with the reality that we may be living in a transitionary period for the rest of our lives, and that revolutions effectively are gradual, even though they are punctuated by these moments that historians can look back in time and say, well, that was a tipping point, or this is the moment where that started to happen. So I think that taking an approach that continues to engage and continues to understand that there is a definitive, although I can't specifically say, relationship between what is happening in the traditional markets and what is happening in emerging third world markets, and how that relates to the price of Bitcoin, which itself reflects the aggregate of people's emotions in response to all kinds of incomplete pieces of information. So, I mean, the thing that's interesting to me is that there is an awful lot of downward price movement across the board in all asset classes just now. And there is a drumbeat of indicators of repression all over the place. At the same time, it's worth sort of ending this ramble here this morning with a reflection on the fact that we do see clearly jurisdictions, communities that are taking a different approach. There is the newly formed ETF in Canada. There is the very happy relationship that seems to be developing between miners and Quebec. I think it's impossible to think that the Swiss National Bank and or the country itself is likely to have invested in something that they think is a scam, worthless, and doesn't reflect a really good point about the realities of certain kind of macro global truths that the Swiss and the Japanese and the Canadians and the Estonians and perhaps some of our brethren in the Bahamas have kind of absorbed and are pursuing a kind of jurisdictional arbitrage for the future, which again, they may not have any real sense of when the shit will hit the fan, so to speak, in the over-leveraged bubble-fied Western financial system. I mean, it's just, I think, important to continue to remember why you made the decisions that you made in the first place. If those are not working out for you, then revisit whether or not you think you were wrong. If you think you're still right, then reflect on the fact that it may just be a question of timing. You may be wrong this morning, but you may not be wrong in the long term. And if you made any of these decisions with any kind of long-term framework, then sit tight or go for a walk and educate somebody who doesn't know anything about this with regards to how control functions in the world. Just start there. Don't even mention blockchains. Don't say crypto, anything. Just try to spread awareness about how people are already functioning under inappropriate levels of control that they need to think about resisting in their lives in whatever way they can.